Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg Learner.
So, hello everybody. Welcome to Online Learning Day.
But then the price skyrockets to $4.
It's okay if there's a little background noise though, right?
You're going to need more.
Because the microphone's got me?
Yeah.
Okay. So welcome to Online Learning Day. What I wanted to do is I wanted to redo the lecture that I did in Block 2 today for your benefit before you watch the two videos and then do the worksheets which the other class got for homework. So what we want to explore today is we want to explore modules 38 through 40. And what we're going to do is instead of starting with module 38, we're going to start with module 40. Because I think module 40 makes a lot more sense at the beginning than at the end of this chapter. The main thing we want to focus upon today is something called the business cycle. Okay. Now the business cycle is something that has come up more in the 20th century. But there was an economist by the name of Kondratiev. He was a Russian economist. And he first noticed that the economy seems to be cyclical. Market economies came about in the 1800s, actually in the 1700s with the Industrial Revolution. But they came with the Industrial Revolution to be more developed. And what he started to notice was that economies started to ebb and flow as if in a cycle. Kondratiev called these Kondratiev waves. But there was not much information other than what he was noticing was happening to tell us exactly why this was happening or what was going on. He just noticed this as a pattern of modern economics, market economics. It wasn't until a successor of his came up with a more detailed version of this theory that we gave it the new name, the business cycle. The person who came up with the more detailed theory was John Maynard Keynes. Okay? So John Maynard Keynes and the business cycle, this is very, very much Keynesian. Now, the business cycle is just this. It's talking about the economy, and it's talking about the ebbs and flows, the peaks and troughs of the economy as it moves along. There's an old saying, can't see the forest for the trees. What does that saying mean? What that saying means is that if you are in a situation, you're in the middle of a forest, you're surrounded by trees. All you really know about are the trees that are immediately around you. You don't have the bigger picture. So when you can't see the forest for the trees, you're in the middle of it, but you don't really know the totality of the whole situation. Seeing the forest from a bird's eye view tells you the greater situation. So this here is something where we're looking at the forest rather than the trees. So let us say for a moment that this is 50 years. And the future is in this direction. Okay? Over this period of time, what has happened economically? The economy has had high points and low points. But what's one thing that you notice about this spiral here? There's a middle line. This would be called the trend line. Okay? Don't worry about this part for a moment. We'll talk about this in a little while. This trend line, you want to notice, if we look at here, if we look at this trough here, and we look at this peak here, what do you notice? If we were to take a measuring stick, we would notice that from here to here, and from here to here, this peak in the economy is lower than this trough in the economy at this time. What that tells us is that the economy, despite the fact of these ebbs and flows, continues to grow, expand, get bigger. When we are in a situation where the economy is moving in this direction, we say that this is expansionary. For the moment, we don't know why it was expanding, but market economies tend to expand. But interestingly, they get to a point here, which we call the peak. I swear that says peak. And at this peak, for some reason, which we can explain in a little bit, the economy hits a high point and then begins to contract. Now, this is called the business cycle, and so sometimes we refer to the economy as cyclical. So for instance, right now, the US economy has been growing steadily since 2009. So in other words, since 2009, we've been on an upswing like this. That's 10 years of growth. The US economy, whatever your politics or anything like that, the US economy is due for a recession. There's going to be a recession. It will probably be soon. How severe will that be? We don't know. Might not be very severe at all. Most recessions in American history aren't that bad in the sense that we recover pretty quickly, okay? Now, one thing about recessions since the Great Depression, the United States government plays a much larger role in trying to stave off recessions and trying to energize the economy. Why is that? Because of the experience of the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a calamity. It was terrible. And the reason for government intervention comes from the fact that at some point during the Great Depression, 4 years after it started, the government finally stepped in, and we have a lot of programs today that didn't exist before or even during the Great Depression that help us to try to stave off depressions. The Great Recession in 2007, 2008, 2009 was a massive upheaval and could have very easily turned into a Great Depression. But the United States government used two tools that you will know about more in the next few classes: fiscal policy and monetary policy, to try to stave off the long-lasting effects of that recession. And indeed, the economy started to grow again in 2009 and has been growing ever since up to this very moment. But economies, like we said, are naturally cyclical. So at some point, soon probably, we're going to hit that peak and we're going to start to go down toward a trough. Okay? Now, the first thing we need to do is we need to put this into perspective. This is our business cycle. But the business cycle is, we're not totally helpless against it. But economists really believe that this was the natural way of things to go. Back in the days before the Great Depression, what economists basically said was that look at this cycle, what we know of this cycle, because they didn't have all the stats that we have today. But they knew that it did happen this way. And the one feature that was consistent was that it always recovered. Every time you went down, you came back up. What causes that? In classical economics, the cause of that is simple. In a market economy, people innovate and invent all the time. And if they're innovating and inventing all the time, then what happens is some of them are going to fail and some of them are going to succeed. When you have a situation where the economy is climbing, you've got lots of people spending lots of money. How are they spending lots of money? Lots of people are in business. You have lots of people, entrepreneurs, who have had ideas. Some of those ideas take off. When some of those ideas take off, they hire people. When those people are hired, they have money in their pockets. They spend that money. What do they spend that money on? Other people's ideas, goods, and services. When they spend that money, those people get that as income. They use that to reinvest in their business. They hire more people. But they're all in a competitive environment. Not all of them are going to be able to compete with each other. Sometimes, some of them fail. But what also happens is while you have this cycle of money happening faster and faster and faster, all things being equal, and that's not necessarily our situation right now, but all things being equal, you get something called inflation. Inflation is the loss of purchasing power of money over time due to the expansion of the money supply. If the money supply expands, then what you have is a situation where each dollar buys less. When you have inflation that starts to go too fast, every economy wants inflation. You want 2 to 3% inflation. That helps. That shows that the economy is growing, and that shows that the economy is headed in the correct direction, up. But if you get beyond 5%, 6%, 7% inflation, now you got a problem. Because all of a sudden you've got wages and prices trying to keep up with each other, and the value of goods and services is not changing. It's just the numbers that are changing. When you get inflation, the economy overheats. And if the economy overheats, and then when some businesses start to fail, or some businesses can't compete anymore, some businesses can't stay up with others, you start to get some failures. Some folks, let's say one business goes out of business. All right? You guys are good?
Yes.
All right, they're good. So let's say a company goes out of business. Its employees lose their jobs. They lose their income. They stop spending. Since they stop spending, your business slows down. If your business slows down, and not to the point where you need to lay people off, but to the point where, to the point where you need to lay people off, but not to the point where you're going to go out of business, okay? Some of those people no longer earn wages, they're not going to be spending. If they're not spending, then there's less money in the economy. The cycle of money creation slows down. As that slows down, fewer people have money, more people are unemployed. As unemployment goes up, inflation comes back down, but what also happens? We head toward a trough. A trough is where the economy hits rock bottom. What revives it, though, is the natural flow of the economy. More people opening up more businesses, and then people starting to get more jobs again, and then the economy recovers. Now, John Maynard Keynes came up with his theory in around 1936. He noticed what was going on in the Depression. He understood, he saw the forest. He didn't just look at the trees. And he saw a brutal picture. And that was this. Most economists were assuming when we got to the Great Depression that, including the president, Herbert Hoover, that the economy was just going to recover. Keynes saw something different. He saw this as a unique situation where the economy was not naturally recovering. It was stuck, if you will, in an elevator that was at the ground floor and could not go back up. So Keynes had some antidote, some solutions that he came up with, which are totally radical back in the day. First of all, in 1929, 1930, 1931, the United States government had no way of measuring, in any national way, unemployment levels, inflation levels. But most importantly, it had no way of measuring total output of the economy. Total output of the economy was invented because of the Great Depression by a gentleman by the name of Simon Kuznets at the behest of Congress in 1932. What he invented was this measure, GNP. Now, we call it today GDP. The difference between GNP and GDP is this. Gross national product is all the output of all American companies and individuals that are affiliated with America. Problem, though. If Ford is making cars in America, if Ford is making cars in Canada, if Ford is making cars in Spain, if Ford is making cars in Mexico, all of those cars count in US GNP. Some of those cars, though, also count in Mexican GNP, Spanish GNP, Canadian GNP. So if that's the case, you're sort of double counting between countries. So in 1991, we switched from GNP to GDP. GDP is gross domestic product. All of the cars that are made in the United States, inside the United States borders, those count. The cars that Ford makes in Canada and Mexico and in Spain don't count at all for American GDP. They count for the GDP of those other countries only. GDP is a much more accurate figure than GNP as far as domestic production goes. But Kuznets was asked to figure out what's the total output of the American economy in 1931, 32, 33, and how does that compare to the 1920s? So he had to come up with a measure that not only he could use going forward, but that he could take whatever statistics we had and measure going backward. And so with that, he came up with the concept of GNP. The sum total of all final goods and services produced in the United States on a either annual or quarterly basis. It depends how you want to measure it. Okay, and then you can break that down to per capita, per person, how much is being produced. Okay, now GNP is invented, and it helps us to measure this, and it helps Keynes to measure the business cycle, and it also gives Keynes some tools to be able to start to talk about managing the business cycle. So let's talk about managing the business cycle. John Maynard Keynes says we are not helpless in allowing the economy to go to its ebbs and flows. John Maynard Keynes says this can be managed, where the government can be used with its taxing and spending power to either expand the economy when it's contracting, or to contract the economy when it's expanding too fast. So Keynes, in essence, sought to do this. He sought to draw two more lines. And these two lines, what you notice is that we never really reach the natural trough, and we never really reach the natural peak. Keynes's tools are set to moderate the economy, to keep us closer to the trend line in the middle. Think of the business cycle here as something that's coiling around the trend. It never leaves the trend. The trend is our mean, it's our average. And what's going up over time is our average size of our economy. Okay? Now, Keynes got the idea of managing this because of this. This is the Great Depression. And what was happening in the Great Depression was that nothing was recovering. In fact, things kept getting worse. In the Great Depression, the government and the Federal Reserve made several mistakes. The government sought to actually cut spending because it saw a balanced budget as more important than stimulating the economy. In fact, stimulating the economy by the government was a completely foreign notion. They also sought to raise interest rates. Now let me explain interest rates for a moment. Inflation is the purchasing power of money. Interest rates are the price of money. None of you have lived through a time in your lives of high inflation or high interest rates. For your entire lives, you have only experienced low interest rates and low inflation. And there are reasons why inflation hasn't gone up since we've had an expanding economy. That's due to monetary policy. We'll get to that later. Okay? But low inflation, low interest rates means that in your lives, you've never had a savings account where money is actually earned every month just for having the money there. So in other words, if you have a savings account of like $500 and high interest rates, you're gonna, at the end of the month, you might have, instead of $500, $550. And then $600 the next month, and then $655 the next month, so on and so forth. High interest rate environment is an incentive for you to keep your money in the bank, not to spend it, because keeping your money in the bank earns you more money. You've never had that. The incentive structure has always been interest rates low, you're encouraged to spend money because not only are you saving less or getting less for your savings, but there may be a technical difficulty.
Yeah.
We're coming in. Goodbye. Mr. Lawrence loved the boat. He gave me the order.
Oh, way to go, partner. Let's have some coffee.
Only half a cup.
I thought you liked fresh brewed coffee.
I love it. It's the caffeine.
Look.
Brim decaffeinated coffee?
Uh-huh.
Well, if it tastes this rich, fill it to the rim.
With brim.
Fill your cup to the rim with the richness of brim.
So not only are you not getting money for your savings, but loans for businesses are cheaper because the interest rate, the price of money is low. Okay? If interest rates are high, businesses are not going to expand as much because they're not going to buy, they're not going to invest, they're not going to buy capital because they don't have the money outright to spend and the loan is expensive. So they look for lower rates. So when you have high interest rates, you're trying to contract the economy, you're trying to slow down consumption, and you're trying to slow it down by A, loans are high priced, B, if you have money in the bank, it actually earns money by just sitting there. Okay? You've never ever experienced that. Now, someday you may, but back in these days, it's a whole different ballgame. The Depression is happening, and the government is cutting spending, and the government is raising interest rates in order to keep gold reserves here. They want the returns to come back to those who have their gold here, like other countries and things like that. So they want to keep that gold here because we're on the gold standard at the time. The US dollar is tied to gold. And so instead of letting the gold go, they say, let's raise interest rates so that there's a return on the investment of leaving the gold here. Well, that worked. But what else did it do? It discouraged businesses from spending, discouraged businesses from expanding, and made the economy worse off than it already was. It was a terrible catch-22 for them at the time. All right, so that brings us to Keynes' equation. Keynes has an equation for the business cycle, and it's this. It's C plus I plus G plus or minus NX equals Y. Y being GDP. Now, what is C? Consumption. Who consumes? You and me and everybody else. Consumption is about 71%. That's a percentage. That should say 71. It's 71% of the economy. Okay? 71% of the economy is people consuming goods and services. I is investment. Don't think of that as purchasing stocks or bonds or anything like that, or anything you do personally. Investment with a capital I in economics is about businesses getting loans, expanding, purchasing capital, developing capital, hiring labor, okay, making things that will produce more things in the future. Investment typically takes up about 15% of the US economy. Okay? Or it is 15% of the portion of the US economy. Government. Today, government spends a ton. The US military budget this year is going to be around $750 billion. Okay? That's 750,000 millions. That's a lot of money. And that's just the military budget alone. The US government will probably spend this year around $3.6 or $3.7 trillion. Okay? That budget takes up about 21% of the economy. Now, for those of you who are inclined to utilize math in your lives, you will notice something. 71%, 15%, and 21% do not equal 100. It's more than 100. Why is it more than 100? Because of NX. NX is net exports. The United States runs what's called a current accounts deficit. Current accounts deficit is a trade deficit. Goods and services more come in than we send out. So we run a trade deficit, as we say. that would be about negative 7%. Don't necessarily interpret this as a bad thing. It gets us to 100%, but we import more than we export for two reasons. Number one, the US dollar is worth more than other currencies. Number two, when things are made over wherever they're being made, they're being shipped here because they can make them cheaper, and if their currency is less valuable than the US currency, then it makes the price even more cheap by comparison. You pay less for goods and services that are imported because if we made them domestically, they'd be more expensive. So we consume what's least expensive with relatively the same quality, okay? So C plus I plus G plus or minus NX equals Y. That's the equation Keynes came up with for the economy and GNP and later GDP. What does that mean to us? That means that if consumption, and this is the whole crux really of Keynes' explanation, if consumption starts to lag and investment starts to lag because consumption has started to lag, the government can step in and spend more and make up the difference, pump more money into the economy through its own consumption, and that will spur more consumption throughout the rest of the economy. So he says demand drives supply, demand drives the economy. Okay, so far so good. So with the business cycle, Keynes is suggesting that we don't have to be victims of the economy. We can actually manage the economy through fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is government taxing and spending. We'll get to monetary policy, which is conducted by the Federal Reserve, which is America's central banking system. We'll get to that later, because that's a whole other ballgame. But the point is that this is where the chapter is going with GNP and GDP. Now what you're going to watch is you're going to watch a couple videos. The first video that I want you to watch is all about this business cycle. It's the second vignette of that video series, and you want to watch that carefully to get concepts that I just talked about in all of this, okay? And it re-explains this in pretty good order. Then you're going to watch a second video about the development of GNP, which today we call GDP. And it's going to tell you the technical definition of GNP, but also the historical context of it. Where did it come from? Why did Simon Kuznets come up with it? What logic did he use to make it? And then finally, there's a worksheet that goes with the chapter, modules 38, 39, and 40, that you want to fill out. And that will be something that we go over when we meet on Monday. So for now, I believe I covered everything that I covered in the previous class, did I not? Pretty much. I might have added a couple little things, left out a couple little things, but overall I got the right ideas in there. And so Max, Shannon, and Paula, thank you very much for recording this for me and allowing this to happen. So have a great online learning day and get your work done, and we'll see you on Monday.